The restaurant was full that evening. It was one of those nights when every table was taken and the air buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the quiet clinking of glasses. The warm lights hanging from the ceiling made the place feel cozy, but the staff knew it would be a long night. Orders were coming in quickly, and everyone moved faster than usual to keep up. Among the waitstaff was a young woman who worked quietly and carefully. She moved between the tables with calm focus, balancing trays and remembering every order without writing anything down. Most guests barely noticed her. To them, she was simply another server doing her job. But the other workers in the restaurant knew she was different. She rarely spoke about her past and kept mostly to herself, but there was always a thoughtful look in her eyes, as if her mind was somewhere else. Near the back wall of the restaurant stood an old piano. It had been there for many years. The wood had faded slightly, and some keys looked worn, but it was still beautiful in its own way. Long ago, the owner had hoped that live music would bring a special charm to the place, but over time, musicians stopped coming regularly. Now the piano mostly sat quietly in the corner, like a forgotten piece of furniture. Sometimes guests would glance at it, but almost no one ever played it. The young waitress passed by that piano many times during her shifts. Most people didn't notice, but every time she walked past it, her eyes lingered on it for just a second longer than usual. It was almost like she was greeting an old friend without saying a word. That evening, a group of wealthy business guests arrived and took a large table near the center of the restaurant. Their expensive suits and confident voices made it clear they were used to being important. They laughed loudly and talked about deals, investments, and big plans for the future. With them was a well-known businessman who owned several companies in the city. People in the restaurant recognized him immediately. He was the kind of person who rarely appeared in public places like this. Usually, someone with his status would be in private clubs or luxury dining rooms. But tonight he had come here with his colleagues after a long meeting. The staff had been warned earlier that important guests were arriving, so everyone tried to be extra careful. The manager watched every detail closely. Plates had to be perfect, drinks had to arrive quickly, and no mistakes were allowed. The young waitress was the one assigned to serve that table. She walked over politely, greeted them, and began taking their orders. The group spoke quickly, sometimes talking over each other, but she stayed calm and listened carefully. Within minutes, she had memorized everything they wanted. One of the men at the table noticed something while she was standing there. His eyes moved from her to the old piano in the corner. Then he smiled in a playful way. "Does anyone here even play that thing anymore?" he asked, pointing toward the piano. The group looked over and laughed lightly. Another man joked, "Maybe it's just decoration." The waitress followed their gaze toward the piano. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she replied softly, "Sometimes people play it." Her voice was calm and simple. The men at the table exchanged curious looks. One of them leaned back in his chair and asked with a teasing tone, "What about you? Can you play?" She hesitated. It was only a brief pause, but it was enough for the group to notice. "I know a little," she said quietly. The table erupted in laughter, though it wasn't cruel laughter. It was the kind people make when they assume something is impossible. "A little?" one of them said with a grin. "That piano hasn't made a real sound in years." Another added, "Well, tonight might be the night." The businessman who led the group had been silent until now. He sat at the end of the table, watching the entire exchange carefully. Unlike the others, he didn't laugh. His expression remained thoughtful. He had spent many years studying people. Running companies had taught him how to read faces and voices. Something about the waitress's quiet answer had caught his attention. It didn't sound like a joke. Meanwhile, the other men at the table continued teasing in a friendly way. "Come on," one of them said. "Play something for us." The waitress shifted slightly, clearly unsure. "I'm working right now," she replied politely. "That's all right," another guest said. "We're not asking for a concert." The first man chuckled and added, "Just a few notes. Consider it a challenge." The word challenge hung in the air. A few nearby diners had started paying attention to the conversation. It was difficult not to notice a group of loud businessmen making jokes in the middle of the restaurant. The waitress looked toward the piano again. For a brief moment, something changed in her expression. It was subtle, but it was there. A quiet memory seemed to pass through her mind. Then she quickly returned to her calm professional tone. "I should bring your drinks first," she said. The group laughed again. "Fair enough," someone replied. She nodded politely and walked back toward the service counter. But as she moved through the restaurant, her thoughts felt different now. The simple question had stirred something inside her that she usually kept buried. Behind the counter, another worker leaned closer and whispered, "What were they saying?" "They want me to play the piano," she answered. The coworker raised their eyebrows in surprise. "Are you going to?" She shook her head slightly. "I'm not sure." Across the room, the businessman continued watching her quietly. While the others had returned to their conversations, he remained thoughtful. He noticed the way she walked past the piano again. And again, her eyes paused on it for a brief moment. That was when he became certain. There was a story behind that glance. When the waitress returned to the table with drinks, the teasing started again. "So," one of the men said with a smile, "have you decided?" She placed the glasses carefully on the table. "Decided what?" she asked. "Whether you'll play for us." The group waited. The businessman finally spoke for the first time. His voice was calm but carried authority. "If she doesn't want to play, let her work," he said. The table grew quiet for a moment. But then one of the others chuckled and said, "It's only a challenge." The businessman looked toward the piano in the corner, then back at the waitress. His expression softened slightly. "Well," he said slowly, "sometimes a simple challenge can reveal something interesting." The waitress didn't reply right away. Around them, the restaurant continued buzzing with normal activity, but the moment felt strangely still. Her eyes moved once more toward the piano. The old instrument sat silently in the corner, waiting. And for the first time that night, the idea of sitting at those keys again didn't feel impossible. But she still wasn't sure if she was ready. The group at the table leaned back in their chairs, smiling with curiosity. To them, it was just a small moment of entertainment. But none of them realized that the quiet waitress standing beside their table carried a story they had never imagined. And the piano in the corner was about to remind her of a part of her life she had tried very hard to forget. The waitress stepped away from the table after placing the drinks down, but the words of the guests stayed in her mind. She tried to focus on her work, moving from one table to another, checking orders and carrying plates from the kitchen. The restaurant was still busy, and there was no time to stand still. But even while she worked, she could feel something stirring inside her. The old piano in the corner seemed louder tonight, even though no one had touched it. She passed by it again while bringing a tray of dishes to another table. Her eyes moved toward it for a moment before she quickly looked away. It had been a long time since she had sat in front of a piano. Years, actually. Life had taken her in a completely different direction. From across the room, the group of businessmen continued talking loudly. Their conversation returned to business deals and investments, but every now and then someone glanced toward the corner where the piano stood. One of the men leaned back in his chair and spoke quietly to the others. "Do you think she really knows how to play?" Another shrugged. "Probably just a few notes." They laughed lightly again. But the businessman sitting at the end of the table didn't laugh. He watched the waitress carefully as she moved through the restaurant. There was something about the way she carried herself. She was calm, steady, and thoughtful. She didn't rush like some of the other staff. Instead, every movement seemed careful and controlled. He had seen many people in his life, from confident executives to nervous beginners trying to impress him. And sometimes he noticed small details others ignored. That quiet pause she had made earlier when they asked about the piano. It had not looked like someone guessing. It looked like someone remembering. Meanwhile, in the kitchen area, the waitress placed another tray on the counter. The warm smell of food filled the room while cooks moved quickly between stoves and ovens. One of the workers glanced at her and asked, "They're still talking about the piano, aren't they?" She gave a small smile. "A little. Are you really going to play?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she wiped her hands slowly with a small cloth and leaned against the counter for a second. "I used to play," she said quietly. The coworker looked surprised. "Really?" She nodded slightly. "When I was younger." "What happened?" For a moment she stared at the floor, as if deciding how much to say. "My father taught me," she said. "He loved music more than anything." Her voice softened as she spoke. "He had an old piano at home. Not fancy, but it worked. When I was little, he would sit beside me and guide my hands over the keys." She paused, remembering. "At first I just played simple songs. But he believed I could do more. Every evening after school we practiced together." The sounds of the busy kitchen continued around them, but for a moment she seemed far away from it all. "He used to say music could tell stories without words," she continued. "When you play from your heart, people can feel it." The coworker listened quietly. "So why did you stop?" they asked. She let out a small breath. "Life changed." Her answer was simple, but the meaning behind it was heavy. Her father had become sick when she was still young. At first it was something small that doctors thought would pass. But over time things became harder. Hospital visits became frequent. Money slowly disappeared. Music lessons, competitions, and practice hours all began to fade away as more important problems took their place. Eventually the piano at home stopped being played. After her father passed away, everything felt different. The house was quieter than it had ever been. The piano stood in the corner of the room, but she couldn't bring herself to touch it anymore. Not because she forgot how to play, but because every note reminded her of him. Soon after, she had to start working to support herself. There was no time for music anymore. Jobs came and went until she finally found work at this restaurant. Years passed. The coworker listened with understanding. "That must have been hard," they said. She nodded. "But you never forgot how to play?" the coworker asked. She gave a faint smile. "I don't think you ever forget something like that." At that moment, the manager called out from the dining area. "Order ready for table 7. She quickly straightened and lifted the tray. "I should get back," she said. As she stepped out of the kitchen again, the sound of the restaurant filled her ears. Conversations, laughter, and the clinking of silverware blended together. She walked toward the table with the businessmen. They were still talking loudly, but when she approached, one of them noticed her again. "Ah, she's back," he said with a grin. The others looked up. "So," another added, "did you think about our challenge?" She placed the plates carefully in front of each guest. "Your food," she said politely. But the men were clearly still curious. "Come on," one of them said. "We're serious. Just play something small." Another pointed toward the piano again. "It's been sitting there all night waiting." She hesitated again. The businessman at the end of the table finally spoke once more. "Why are you pushing her?" he asked calmly. "It's just for fun," one of the others replied. The businessman looked at the waitress. "Do you want to play?" he asked. His voice was different from the others. There was no teasing in it. Just a simple question. For a moment she didn't know how to answer. She looked toward the piano again. The warm light above it reflected softly on the wooden surface. It looked peaceful there in the corner, far away from the busy tables. Memories returned to her again. Her father smiling proudly when she learned a difficult piece. The sound of applause during small school recitals. The feeling of sitting at the piano and letting the music flow through her hands. It had been so long. Too long. "I haven't played in years," she admitted quietly. One of the men laughed gently. "All the more reason to try." Another added, "What's the worst that could happen?" But the businessman continued watching her carefully. Sometimes people avoided things not because they couldn't do them, but because they meant too much. The waitress stood there for a moment longer. Then she spoke slowly. "I'm still working," she said. One of the guests checked his watch and smiled. "Our food just arrived," he replied. "We'll be here for a while." The others nodded in agreement. "No rush," someone added. The suggestion hung in the air again. Not a demand, but an invitation. She felt her heart beating a little faster now. Playing the piano had once been the most natural thing in her life. Yet now the thought of sitting in front of those keys made her nervous. What if she had forgotten too much? What if the music didn't come back? Across the room, a few other guests had begun noticing the conversation. Their curiosity slowly spread through the restaurant. The waitress realized that if she played now, many people would be watching. That thought made her even more unsure. The businessman finally leaned back in his chair and said calmly, "Finish your work first." Everyone looked at him. "If she plays," he continued, "it should be because she chooses to." The table grew quiet again. The waitress nodded slightly. "Thank you," she said. Then she walked away to continue her shift. But something inside her had already changed. The idea of touching the piano again had planted itself in her mind. And with every step she took across the restaurant floor, the memory of those old melodies grew a little stronger. The restaurant slowly settled into a calmer rhythm as the night moved forward. The first rush of dinner had passed, and many guests were now enjoying their meals at a more relaxed pace. Conversations continued around the room, but the loud energy from earlier had softened. The waitress continued doing her work just like before. She cleared empty plates, brought fresh drinks, and checked on guests with the same quiet care. Anyone watching from the outside would think nothing had changed. But inside her mind, the situation felt very different. The piano was still there in the corner, and now it felt like it was waiting. Every time she passed it, she felt the same pull she had been trying to ignore all evening. It wasn't just the instrument itself. It was everything connected to it. Old memories, old feelings, and a part of herself she had not touched in years. At the large table in the middle of the room, the group of businessmen had finished most of their meals. Their conversation had shifted from serious topics to more relaxed ones. Some of them leaned back in their chairs while sipping drinks. One of them glanced toward the piano again. "So," he said quietly to the others, "do you think she'll actually play?" Another shrugged. "I'm not sure." She looked nervous. A third man smiled slightly. "Maybe she really can play and just doesn't want attention." They all looked briefly toward the waitress moving between tables. The businessman at the end of the table noticed their conversation but stayed silent. He had been watching the situation carefully all evening. Unlike the others, he wasn't interested in entertainment or teasing. He was curious. There was something genuine about the way the waitress had spoken earlier. It didn't sound like someone trying to impress people. It sounded like someone protecting something important. Across the room, the waitress returned to the kitchen area with a small stack of plates. The cooks were cleaning their stations and preparing the last orders of the night. Her coworker looked up at her again. "They're still waiting," they said with a small smile. She sighed softly. "I know. Are you thinking about it?" She leaned against the counter for a moment, thinking, "I don't know if I should." Her coworker nodded with understanding. "Maybe you should." She looked surprised. "Why?" "Because you've been looking at that piano all night." The waitress laughed quietly at that. "Was it that obvious?" "A little." She stared down at her hands. "I just don't want to make a mistake," she admitted. Her coworker shook their head gently. "I don't think anyone expects perfection. They just want to hear something." But the waitress knew it wasn't that simple. Playing a few random notes would be easy. Anyone could do that. But the piano meant more to her than that. If she played, she wanted it to feel real. At that moment, the manager walked into the kitchen and looked around. "Most of the orders are done," he said. "We'll start closing in about half an hour." The waitress nodded. She suddenly realized something. If she was going to play, it would have to be soon. Back in the dining area, the businessmen had finished their meals. Plates were cleared away, and drinks remained on the table. One of them stretched his arms and said, "That was a good dinner." Another added, "But we're still waiting for the music." They laughed again. The businessman at the end of the table didn't laugh. Instead, he glanced toward the kitchen door. At that moment, the waitress stepped out again. She carried a small tray with fresh water glasses. The men noticed her immediately. "Here she comes," one of them said with a grin. She placed the glasses down quietly. "Anything else for you?" she asked politely. One of the guests leaned forward slightly. "Just one thing." She already knew what he was going to say. "The piano," he said. The others smiled. But before anyone could tease her again, the businessman spoke calmly. "You don't have to if you don't want to." His tone was simple and respectful. For a moment the table became quiet again. The waitress looked toward the piano. Then she looked back at the group. Her heart was beating faster now, but something inside her felt different. The nervous feeling was still there, but so was something stronger. A quiet courage she hadn't felt in a long time. She took a slow breath. "I can try," she said. The words were soft, but everyone heard them clearly. The men at the table exchanged surprised looks. "Really?" one of them said. She nodded once. "I'll be right back." She walked toward the kitchen again, leaving the group watching her. Her coworker noticed her expression immediately. "You decided?" they asked. She nodded. "I'll play something." The coworker smiled widely. "That's great." But the waitress still looked nervous. "I just need a minute." She washed her hands slowly and dried them carefully with a towel. Then she stood still for a moment. She remembered sitting beside her father at the piano years ago. He used to say something before every performance. "Don't think about the people watching," he would tell her. "Just listen to the music." She took another deep breath. Then she walked back into the dining area. The room had grown quieter now. Several guests had noticed the situation and were watching with curiosity. The businessmen sat patiently at their table. When she appeared, one of them smiled and said, "We thought you changed your mind." She shook her head gently. "I said I would try." Slowly, she began walking toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last. The restaurant seemed strangely quiet now. Even people who had been talking moments ago lowered their voices. She reached the corner where the piano stood. Up close, it looked even older than she remembered. The wood had small scratches, and the bench creaked slightly as she touched it. For a moment she just stood there. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the piano. Memories filled her mind again. Childhood evenings filled with music. Her father clapping proudly after she finished a song. The feeling of joy when a melody flowed perfectly. She slowly sat down on the bench. Across the room, every pair of eyes was now focused on her. The businessmen leaned forward slightly. Even the restaurant staff paused their work. She placed her hands gently above the keys. For a second, she hesitated. The piano felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she pressed the first key. The sound was soft but clear. A few people in the restaurant straightened in their chairs. She played another note, then another. At first the melody moved slowly, like someone testing the water before stepping in. Her fingers adjusted to the feeling of the keys again. But after a few seconds, something began to change. Her hands started moving more naturally. The music grew smoother. It was as if the years between then and now slowly disappeared. Across the room, the businessmen stopped whispering to each other. The playful smiles faded. They began listening. The businessman at the end of the table leaned forward slightly. He had expected a few simple notes, but what he heard instead made him look up with real interest. The melody flowing from the piano was gentle, but it carried something deeper. It didn't sound like someone guessing. It sounded like someone remembering. And with every note that filled the room, the quiet waitress seemed less like a nervous server and more like someone who had once belonged on that piano bench all along. The first few notes floated softly through the restaurant. At the beginning, the sound was gentle, almost careful, like someone walking slowly after a long time away from a familiar path. The waitress kept her eyes on the piano keys, letting her fingers move naturally without forcing anything. A few people continued their conversations for a moment, but it didn't take long before the music caught their attention. The melody had something warm inside it, something calm and thoughtful. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simple, but it felt real. One by one, voices around the room began to fade. The businessmen at the large table stopped talking completely. They leaned back in their chairs, watching the corner where the waitress sat at the piano. Earlier they had been smiling with playful curiosity, expecting something small and awkward. But now their expressions were different. The music slowly filled the room in a way none of them expected. The waitress continued playing, her fingers moving with more confidence as the seconds passed. At first she had been nervous, unsure if her hands would remember what to do. But now the familiar feeling was returning. The piano keys felt like old friends she had not seen in years. Across the room, one of the restaurant workers quietly whispered to another, "I didn't know she could play like that." The other worker simply nodded, unable to take their eyes off the piano. At the large table, one of the businessmen leaned closer to his friend and said softly, "This isn't just someone who knows a little." Another nodded slowly. "You're right." The businessman sitting at the end of the table remained silent. His eyes stayed fixed on the waitress, listening carefully to every part of the melody. There was something thoughtful about his expression now, something deeper than simple surprise. He had spent his life attending concerts, business events, and expensive performances. He had heard professional musicians play in beautiful halls and theaters. But this moment felt different. This music was not part of a performance. It was something personal. The melody began to grow slightly stronger. The waitress let her hands move across the keys more freely now, her confidence slowly returning. Her shoulders relaxed, and her breathing became steady. She was no longer thinking about the people watching her. Instead, she was listening to the music itself. The restaurant lights reflected softly on the polished wood of the piano as her fingers moved from one side of the keyboard to the other. The sound carried through the room in gentle waves. Some guests who had been eating quietly set their forks down. Others turned their chairs slightly so they could see the corner more clearly. Even people who had arrived only a few minutes earlier sensed that something special was happening. The manager stood near the counter, watching with wide eyes. He had hired the waitress months ago and had always known she was hardworking and polite, but he had never seen this side of her before. Back at the piano, the music shifted slightly. The melody grew richer, filled with deeper emotion. It sounded less like practice and more like a story being told without words. Inside her mind, the waitress felt old memories returning again. She remembered sitting beside her father when she was small, her feet barely touching the floor while she practiced scales. He used to sit patiently beside her, guiding her fingers when she made mistakes. "Slow down," he would say gently. "Let the music breathe." She remembered the way he would smile when she finally played a difficult part correctly. The memory brought warmth to her chest, but it also carried sadness. For a brief moment her hands slowed, but then she continued playing. Instead of stopping the feeling, she let it become part of the music. The melody grew even more powerful now, filled with quiet emotion that spread through the restaurant like a soft wave. The room had become completely silent. Even the sounds from the kitchen had paused. The businessmen at the large table were no longer leaning back casually. Several of them now sat forward, elbows resting lightly on the table as they watched the piano. One of them whispered quietly, "I didn't expect this." Another shook his head slowly. "Neither did I." The businessman at the end of the table still said nothing. But something about his expression had changed. There was a thoughtful look in his eyes now, almost like the music had taken him somewhere far away. For a moment he remembered something from his own life. Many years ago, before business meetings and company responsibilities filled every day, he had once loved music too. His mother used to play the piano at home when he was a child. The sound had filled their house during quiet evenings. But as time passed, life became busy, and those small moments slowly disappeared. Listening to the waitress play now brought those forgotten memories back to the surface. Meanwhile, the waitress continued playing with growing confidence. Her fingers moved smoothly across the keys now, almost as if the long break from music had never happened. Every note flowed into the next one naturally. The melody rose gently, then softened again, like waves moving across calm water. At a nearby table, a couple who had been celebrating a birthday stopped talking completely. The woman rested her chin lightly on her hand, watching the pianist with quiet admiration. "This is beautiful," she whispered. The man nodded in agreement. Around the room, several guests slowly took out their phones, not to distract themselves, but to capture the moment. But the waitress didn't notice any of it. Her focus stayed entirely on the piano. For the first time in years, she felt the same peaceful connection she once had with the music. The restaurant, the people, and the noise of daily life all faded into the background. There was only the melody. As the piece continued, it reached its most emotional part. The notes became deeper, filled with quiet strength. The kind of music that didn't need loud sounds to be powerful. When she reached the final section of the melody, her hands slowed again. The notes became softer, more delicate. One by one, the final tones floated through the room. And then the last note faded into silence. For a moment, no one moved. The restaurant remained completely quiet. The waitress kept her hands resting lightly on the piano keys, her heart beating faster as she realized the music had ended. She slowly lifted her hands. The silence lasted another second. Then suddenly, applause filled the room. It started at one table, then another, and quickly spread across the entire restaurant. Guests smiled and clapped with genuine appreciation. Some even stood up. The waitress looked up in surprise. Her cheeks warmed slightly as she realized everyone had been watching. At the large table, the businessmen were clapping too. But the man at the end of the table did something different. Instead of clapping immediately, he slowly stood up from his chair. His eyes remained fixed on the young woman at the piano. And as the applause continued around the room, he began walking toward the corner where she sat, clearly wanting to say something that no one else had expected. The applause continued for several seconds after the final note faded away. People around the restaurant smiled, some still clapping while others simply sat quietly, looking toward the corner where the piano stood. The sound of appreciation filled the room in a warm and unexpected way. The waitress remained seated at the piano bench for a moment. Her hands rested gently in her lap as she tried to understand what had just happened. Only a few minutes earlier she had been nervous, unsure if she could even play again after so many years. Now the entire room was looking at her with admiration. She felt her cheeks grow warm. Attention had never been something she enjoyed. Slowly, she stood up from the bench and gave a small, polite nod toward the guests who were applauding. "Thank you," she said quietly, though her voice was almost lost in the clapping. Near the center of the restaurant, the group of businessmen had also joined the applause. But the man sitting at the end of the table had already stood up. Instead of clapping loudly like the others, he walked slowly toward the piano. Several people noticed him moving across the room. Because of his reputation, many recognized him immediately. His presence carried a quiet authority that made others pay attention. The waitress noticed him approaching and felt slightly nervous again. She had served him earlier that evening, but now the situation felt very different. He stopped a few steps away from the piano. For a moment he simply looked at her, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he spoke in a calm voice. "That was beautiful." His tone was sincere and steady. It didn't sound like polite praise. It sounded like honest appreciation. The waitress gave a small smile, still unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said softly. By now the rest of the restaurant had grown quieter again. Guests were curious to hear what the businessman would say next. Back at the table, his colleagues watched with interest. One of them leaned closer to another and whispered, "I didn't expect him to get up like that." "Neither did I," the other replied quietly. At the piano, the businessman continued speaking. "How long have you been playing?" he asked. The waitress hesitated before answering. "I learned when I was younger." He nodded slightly. "That wasn't beginner music." She looked down briefly, almost shy. "I used to practice a lot," she explained. "But I stopped years ago." "Why?" The question was simple, but it carried genuine curiosity. For a moment she thought about how to answer. "My father taught me," she said slowly. "Music was very important to him." The businessman listened quietly. "He passed away when I was still young," she continued. "After that, life became busy." She didn't say much more, but the meaning behind her words was clear enough. The businessman nodded again, understanding more than she might have expected. Sometimes life pulls people away from the things they love, he said. His voice carried a thoughtful tone, as if he was speaking from personal experience. Around them, guests continued watching quietly. One of the restaurant workers stood near the counter, whispering to another employee. "I can't believe this is happening," they said. The other worker nodded. She never told anyone she could play like that. Back near the piano, the businessman glanced briefly at the instrument itself. "This piano has been here a long time," he said. The waitress smiled faintly. "I can tell. Most people probably never noticed it before tonight." She looked at the keys for a moment. "It deserves to be played," she replied. The businessman smiled slightly at that answer. "Yes," he said, "it does." Behind him, his colleagues had now stood up from their table and walked a little closer. They looked far less playful than they had earlier in the evening. One of them spoke first. "I have to admit," he said with a small laugh, "we expected something very different." The waitress looked at him politely. "You asked for a few notes," she said. Another man shook his head in amazement. "That was much more than a few notes." They all chuckled lightly, but their expressions showed real respect now. The teasing tone from earlier had completely disappeared. The businessman turned back toward her again. "You said you stopped playing years ago," he said. "Yes. And you work here full time?" She nodded. "Yes." He folded his arms thoughtfully. "That's surprising." She looked slightly confused. "Why?" "Because talent like that usually finds its way onto a stage somewhere." The waitress shook her head gently. "Life doesn't always work that way." He seemed to consider her words carefully. "Maybe not," he agreed. "But sometimes opportunities appear when people least expect them." She wasn't sure what he meant by that. The businessman looked around the restaurant for a moment. Several guests were still watching the conversation with interest. Then he looked back at her. "Tell me something," he said. She waited quietly. "If someone gave you the chance to play again seriously, would you want that?" The question caught her by surprise. For a moment she didn't answer. Her eyes moved back toward the piano keys. The idea of returning to music had once seemed impossible. Over the years she had accepted a different kind of life. Working long shifts, paying bills, moving forward day by day. But sitting at the piano tonight had reminded her of something she thought was gone forever. The feeling of music flowing naturally through her hands. She looked back at the businessman. "I would," she admitted quietly. Her voice carried honesty rather than excitement. It was the answer of someone who had not allowed themselves to dream about that possibility for a very long time. The businessman gave a small nod. "I thought so." Behind him, his colleagues looked curious now. One of them asked, "What are you thinking?" The businessman didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned toward the manager who was standing near the counter. "Excuse me," he called politely. The manager quickly walked over. "Yes, sir?" The businessman gestured lightly toward the piano. "Do you have live music here often?" The manager shook his head. "Not really. We used to, but not anymore." "That's unfortunate." The manager looked confused. "Why do you say that?" The businessman smiled slightly. "Because tonight you clearly have someone who could change that." The manager glanced toward the waitress with surprise. "I had no idea she could play like this," he admitted. The businessman turned back toward her again. "Well," he said calmly, "I think it's time more people discovered that." The waitress felt her heart beat a little faster. She still didn't know exactly what he was planning. But something about his tone suggested that the simple challenge from earlier in the evening had just turned into something far more important than anyone expected. The restaurant had grown quiet again, but the feeling in the room was very different from earlier that night. What had started as a simple dinner had slowly turned into something no one expected. Many guests were still watching the corner where the piano stood, curious about what would happen next. The waitress stood beside the piano bench, unsure what to do with all the attention. She had only meant to play a short melody and return to work. But now the situation had taken on a life of its own. The businessman looked at her thoughtfully for a moment before speaking again. You said you stopped playing because life became busy, he said calmly. She nodded. Yes. And before that, did you ever perform somewhere? Competitions, concerts, things like that? She thought for a moment. A few small recitals when I was younger, she replied. Nothing big. The businessman smiled slightly. That may be true, he said. But talent doesn't disappear just because someone steps away from it. His colleagues were now standing nearby, listening closely. Earlier in the evening, they had been the ones joking and challenging her. But now their faces showed genuine respect. One of them crossed his arms and said, You should have seen our faces at the table when she started playing. Another laughed quietly. We thought she would press a few random keys. The waitress smiled a little at that. I almost did, she admitted. The group laughed gently, but the mood remained warm and respectful. The businessman turned his attention toward the restaurant manager again. Would you mind if we talked for a moment? He asked. Of course, the manager replied quickly. They stepped a few feet away, but not far enough that others couldn't see them speaking. The manager looked curious and slightly nervous. Is everything all right? He asked. The businessman nodded. More than all right. I think something interesting just happened in your restaurant tonight. The manager smiled awkwardly. Yes, I suppose it did. The businessman glanced toward the piano again where the waitress stood quietly. Do you know how many people noticed her playing? He asked. The manager looked around the room. Many guests were still talking about it. Quite a few, he admitted. That's what I thought. The businessman spoke calmly but with confidence. I host several events every year. Charity dinners, business gatherings, community programs. Many of them include live music. The manager listened carefully. And good musicians are not always easy to find. The businessman continued. The manager nodded slowly. That's true. The businessman then looked back toward the waitress. Tonight I heard something genuine, he said. Not just skill, but feeling. The manager followed his gaze. She has always been hardworking, he said quietly. But she never told anyone about her music. The businessman gave a small smile. Some people carry their best talents quietly. After a moment, the two men walked back toward the piano. The waitress looked up as they approached. The businessman spoke to her again. I was just talking with the manager, he said. And I have a question for you. She waited patiently. In a few weeks, I'm hosting a charity event in the city, he explained. There will be many guests there. Business leaders, families, and people who support local programs. She listened carefully, not yet understanding where the conversation was going. We usually hire musicians for these events, he continued. But tonight I heard something that made me think differently. His colleagues watched with growing curiosity. The waitress felt her heart beating faster again. What are you saying? She asked gently. The businessman smiled. I would like to invite you to play at that event. For a moment she thought she had misunderstood him. Play there? She repeated. Yes. Her eyes widened slightly. I'm not a professional musician, she said quickly. You just reminded a whole room how powerful music can be, he replied calmly. The restaurant had grown quiet again as nearby guests realized something important was being discussed. The waitress looked down at the piano keys again. Part of her felt excited, but another part felt unsure. It's been so long, she said softly. I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that. The businessman nodded with understanding. That's fair. He paused for a moment before continuing. But sometimes the hardest step is simply starting again. His colleagues nodded in agreement. One of them added, If tonight was you after years away from the piano, I'd say you're more ready than you think. The waitress let out a small breath. She remembered the feeling she had just experienced while playing. The music had come back more naturally than she expected. Still, the idea of performing in front of a large crowd felt overwhelming. The businessman seemed to notice her hesitation. This isn't pressure, he said calmly. It's an opportunity, and you can take time to decide. He reached into his pocket and took out a small card. "This has my office contact information," he explained, handing it to her. She looked at the card carefully. "If you decide you want to try," he continued, "call us. We'll help arrange everything." The waitress held the card gently in her hand. For years she had focused only on getting through each day, working hard and staying practical. Dreams like music had slowly faded into the background. But tonight had reminded her that those dreams were still alive somewhere inside her. The businessman smiled warmly. "Either way," he said, "thank you for playing tonight." His colleagues nodded. "Yes," one of them said, "you made this dinner unforgettable." Another added with a laugh, "And you definitely won the challenge." The waitress laughed softly at that. "I wasn't trying to win anything." "Well," the man replied, "you did." Around the room, a few guests began clapping again lightly, showing their support. The waitress looked around in surprise. She hadn't expected the evening to turn out like this at all. The businessman and his group soon returned to their table to prepare for leaving. As they gathered their coats and finished their drinks, they continued talking about the unexpected performance. Before leaving the restaurant, the businessman walked past the piano one more time. He looked at the waitress and said simply, "Don't forget what you did tonight." She nodded. "I won't." A few minutes later, the group left the restaurant, disappearing into the cool night outside. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm again. Guests finished their meals, conversations restarted, and the staff continued cleaning tables. But the waitress remained near the piano for a moment longer. She looked down at the small card still resting in her hand. For the first time in many years, the future felt slightly different. Not because everything had suddenly changed, but because a door she thought was closed forever had quietly opened again. She placed the card carefully into her pocket. Then she ran her fingers gently across the piano keys one more time, smiling softly. Tonight had started with a simple challenge, but it had ended with something far more powerful. The return of a part of her life she thought she had lost forever.